Today was the day. The day she would finally get to see everything. All the wonders she's been told about, all the mysteries. She would finally get to experience what they've been telling her about for so many years. It's been 3 generations now since they settled on this planet. There were others before them. They call them the second ones. The second significant species to inhabit this place. There were also first ones at some point, who were said to be a little more sophisticated than the second ones, but sadly there was pretty much nothing left of them. Even the second ones have been extinct for quite some time, and most of the traces have faded over the years. But there's still a few sites the government has had restored for educational purposes. They call them the Odd Affairs, and today, on her 13th birthday, she was finally allowed to see them. When she woke up, she immediately started packing her stuff, the special shoes for this occasion. After that, she printed herself a good breakfast with the new Eco printer X and got ready to leave. Today, she left especially early, because before she would go to her school trip to the Odd Affairs, she wanted to see her grandpa again. She liked her grandpa. He was like her mentor. Whenever her parents only told her half-truths, he wasn't afraid to tell her the reality. He was one of the only ones who really talked to her on the same level. And so, it wasn't a big surprise that he was the one who introduced her to the second ones too. She was only 5 then, and most of her class peers didn't even know that there was another species before them. Her grandpa had confidence in her mind, and she appreciated that. She learned most things about the second ones from him. He was very interested in them himself and was always telling her stories, how they looked, what they wore, how they talked. And that's how she herself got interested in them really quickly as well. It was something in the way her grandpa talked about them, even though he generally described them as rather simple, almost dull. When talking about them, there was always this tone of a sincere feeling in his voice. She was never sure what it was exactly, but it felt like a mix of compassion and sadness. This morning they didn't talk for long, just some casual stuff about how happy he was to see her and that now they would finally be able to talk about the second ones properly. She obviously couldn't help but feel excited as well. She had dreamed about this day for half of her life and now it had finally come. They talked a little more and then wished each other goodbye and she left. The last thing she wanted was to be late on such a day. When she arrived at school, all of her classmates already waited for her, so they immediately went on a bus. It was gonna be a long day. Some of her classmates congratulated her on becoming 13. She was the youngest in her class, which is why they had to wait so long for the school trip. Only 13-year-olds and older are allowed to visit the Odd Affairs, which she always thought of as very weird, but at the same time, it did undeniably increase her curiosity even more. She even noticed her friends being really excited, even though they had never really shown much of an interest in the second ones. But she didn't mind. After all, if others were also excited, their teacher would maybe give them a little more time to explore. After they left the bus, they got on an under train, and after about 1.5 hours of sitting and waiting, they finally arrived at their first destination. The first of the 3 Odd Affairs they would visit that day. They left the train, exited the station, and then, after being blinded by the sun for a few seconds, they finally saw it. The first Odd Affair. But this wasn't it, right? This was way too much. Sure, the second ones had used this as a factory, so there had to be some engineering involved, but this was more advanced than anything she had ever seen. Not in her wildest dreams would she have believed that this was built and used by the second ones. She was told they had a primitive approach to life, yet in front of her there was a huge landscape of towers, hangars, and tubes connecting them in intricate ways, changing connections on the fly while some kind of items were shipped through them. She just imagined some box buildings with maybe 1 or 2 towers on top of them, but nothing like this. No, this had to be wrong. All her classmates didn't seem to be much impressed, but she knew how the second ones were like. Her grandpa had told her they were simple, naive. But this wasn't simple at all. No primitive designs, no slow process, no fault. This did not look like the second ones. No, this looked like something her species would build. She was not sure this must have been a mistake. It was way too advanced, way too big, way too much like what they themselves built. It just didn't add up. And so she quickly looked around, found her teacher, and confronted her. She was sure the teacher would be happy that somebody noticed this mistake. She had paid attention. But when she told the teacher about it, she just smiled briefly before reassuring her that, no, this was one of the odd affairs. This, what she was seeing in front of her eyes, was built completely by the second ones. She couldn't believe it. This was not what her grandpa had told her at all. There must be another explanation. Maybe her species had modified it to look familiar. But no, that would go against the rules of the odd affairs. They only exist for the sole purpose of showing how the second ones were. It wouldn't make sense to modify them. You know what? That's just the outside. It probably just looks more complicated than it actually is. And inside the facility, she would find that simple but beautiful architecture that she had imagined for the second ones for all this time. Yeah, that must be it. Thankfully, they were allowed to explore by themselves for now. The teacher had said something about that they were supposed to experience it freely, make their own image of the second ones. They would discuss everything in the next few weeks in school. But she didn't really listen to the last few sentences, as she was already running towards the entrance of the factory. It was a big metal door, a little rusty on the edges, but overall in good shape. Nonetheless, she had to put her whole weight against it to push it open. It made a soft clicking noise, and then slowly gave way. When she got in, she stood in a small room. On both her sides were windows to peculiar rooms. There were dozens of monitors plastering the wall and a few buttons of which she couldn't understand the function of. In front of her was a barred wall, which had an opening that must have been used as a door. Fortunately for her, it was open, so she could pass right through into the next room. Confused, she looked around. Huge towering machines working together to make precise movements, processing whatever they were working on in fractions of seconds before transporting the goods to the next set of machines, ready to take it from there. It was all packed together for a most efficient flow of working. Everything seemed precise, so seamless, perfect. It was at this moment that she suddenly recalled what her grandpa had told her when she left this morning for the school trip. It will all make sense. You will see. Then she didn't really think about it, but now she had to. Because it didn't make sense. None of it did. This was all way too complex, way too prudent, way too smart. Nothing like her grandpa had described. She went deeper and deeper and found herself amazed from time to time by working steps she previously hadn't even thought possible for anyone, not even her species. The more she couldn't understand what the machines were doing, the more she understood why the government wanted to maintain the odd affairs. There was so much to learn here. But as her amazement grew, her confusion did as well. She still couldn't get over the fact that this was all built by the second ones. After all, that was not how they were like. Her grandpa had told her. She was almost a bit angry at him at this point. This was all wrong. She explored for a bit more and then returned to the other train station they had come from. Almost all of her class was already there. After a few minutes, they were complete and entered the train again to get to the next auto fair. This time, they only drove for what felt like 15 minutes. Still trying to process what she had seen at the last auto fair, she was one of the last to leave the station at the next. And when she looked up this time, she was actually pleasantly surprised. Now this made much more sense. It was simple, sure, but overall neatly laid out and kind of satisfying in a way. It was just how her grandpa told her. Just what she had imagined. Maybe the first auto fair was just a special case. It must have been. Now sadly, her species didn't preserve this site very well. When she asked for the reason, nobody wanted to give her a good answer. Not assuming much, she just went on her way and explored the auto fair. The first glass dome she looked at had a really small stream of water flowing through the middle of it, with thriving green grasslands on both sides of it, and a couple of old trees standing here and there. She didn't know if all that was the work of the second ones or if it just grew afterwards, but it all seemed very peaceful. She walked a little further around the dome, and that was when she saw a sign. It was fairly big, almost bigger than herself, and had a lot of text in the language of the second ones on it. She couldn't understand much, but with the help of two pictures next to it, she theorized what this was. They must have tried to work with nature. And when she knew that, she noticed so much more about this autofair. When she now looked around, she didn't see some domes plastered throughout an area. She saw different environmental zones neatly built alongside in some kind of pattern. On each dome, a couple of signs with pictures of other species that must have housed there. Were the second ones able to create nature themselves? Did they work together with other species? She didn't know if her species had ever tried to capture nature, but she certainly knew that they had never succeeded. But no, this all made no sense. After all, it was the second ones they were talking about. They were supposed to be primitive, simple-minded, right? This all just didn't fit them. Her grandpa told her the truth, and he wouldn't lie to her, right? She quickly ran towards other domes to investigate. Most of them were worn by time, but you could still see the main point of them. There were all types of colored sand in them. The domes had different temperatures. Some domes were bright, others were in near full darkness. All of it seemed to be perfected for one specific condition. Not knowing what to think about all this, she started running towards the building in the middle of the autofair, hoping she would find some answers there, only for her hopes to be crushed again when entering. This didn't answer anything. Quite the opposite. In front of her were huge cubes of glass filled with water, stacked on top and next to each other and reaching as far as she could see. What were the second ones doing here? Why would they build this? Desperately, she looked for some clues on the glass cubes, but couldn't find anything. She ran along the line of cubes to look for something new, but it was all the same. It was only when she walked into a narrow side hall that she saw a door leading to what seemed to be a different section. Going through, she entered a comparably small and neglected room. It had two dim lights and no windows, and in front of her were models of weird-looking animals. There was something familiar about them, but she couldn't figure out what it was. There was a small sign on the wall. Again, she couldn't understand much of it, but she could translate a few words. One frequently occurring word was primitive. She learned that before the trip because she wanted to know if the second ones knew that they themselves were primitive, which now made her feel a little dumb in hindsight because from what she had seen, they weren't so primitive at all. She looked at the text a second time, trying to get at least some more information out of it, and then pretty quickly got stuck on one word. It was mentioned even more than the word for primitive. It was also a word she knew. It stood for the first ones. And with that realization, she suddenly got really mad. Those models in the room were the first ones. That's how she knew them. But this just made her even angrier. It made no sense. The first ones were supposed to be wiser. They knew what life was about. And now she learns that the first ones were the ones that were primitive? Much more than the second ones? A bad feeling emerged in her stomach. She didn't want to really acknowledge this option before, but did her grandfather lie to her? Pretty much everything he told her was now proven wrong. The second ones weren't primitive. Not at all. Hell, they might have even been smarter than her species. She normally would have never believed that her grandfather would lie to her, but there was just no other explanation. The first autofair already didn't fit in, and this one did definitely not make it any better. For the first time in her life, she was genuinely mad at her grandfather. He had betrayed her. At least, it's very likely. Why did he do it? Did he just have fun fooling her? As much as it didn't fit him, she just couldn't find another explanation. The situation didn't get better when she walked back to the other train station, only to hear a few of her classmates make fun of her because she had always been the one lecturing them about the second ones, but now even she had to admit that what she had told them was completely wrong. On the ride to the last autofair, she sat alone. which was fine by her, because if someone else would have tried to talk to her, she would have either screamed at them or just started crying, or both. She just wished she had never gone to school on that day. Just sit at home and celebrate her birthday with her family, when everything was still how she imagined it. That would have been nice. Definitely better than this. When they arrived at the last auto fair, she only slowly left the station. Her excitement was almost completely gone, and when she looked up, she just sighed. Here we go again. This auto fair was a place most of the second ones had lived at, and to no surprise, it exceeded her expectations. Again. She wandered a bit around. There were huge tower-like buildings trying to challenge the sky, getting bigger and bigger the further she went into the maze of structures. It almost seemed like a huge beehive. Between every building there was a gap of a few meters. Filling it were thousands of huge metal heads. They had eyes on the front, eyes on the back. Some parts were see-through. She couldn't figure out what they were used for, but honestly, she didn't even really bother anymore. She was now sure her grandfather lied to her. Why? Just why would her grandfather do that? She didn't even want to look at more of the auto fair, so she just returned to the undertrain station. Just looking back at the auto fair made her angry. Even though she wanted to be alone, she was glad when her classmates came so they could leave. She wanted to confront her grandfather, now. The way back took a while. They first drove with the undertrain, then got on the bus again. But when the doors of that bus opened, she made sure that she was the first one to leave. She took all her stuff, didn't even bother to say goodbye to anyone, and started marching in the direction of her grandfather's house. When she arrived, she rang the door and was actually surprised by how fast her grandpa opened. Then again, he had probably planned all of this and was just waiting for her to return so he could laugh at her. He looked at her a bit confused and asked her to come in. She followed with a grim face. "What's the matter, dear?" That was enough for her. He didn't have to keep up the mask. She knew the truth. "Why?" she shouted. Her grandfather looked surprised and concerned at the same time. "Why what? Why did you lie to me? You said the second ones were primitive. Do you know how foolish you made me look?" "I didn't lie to you." Irritated, she just shouted back, "Yes, you did. They had huge factories, worked with nature, massive cities, and they knew the first ones. The first ones were the primitive, not them. Why would you lie to me for all this time?" He looked down for a second and sighed. That must have been how I was when I first learned about the second ones. And you're right. They had achieved a lot, and I didn't want to take that away from them. But as you will see soon too, they didn't know what they were doing. Sure, they had learned how to produce, but forgot what they were producing for. They had learned how to keep nature, but forgot to protect the rest of nature that had given them life. They had lived in huge communities, but in their minds, they were further away from each other than ever. And that was their demise. See, contrary to the first ones, they knew how they would go down. They knew it and could have changed it, but chose to ignore it. I'm sorry, it might seem that they are smart, and maybe they were, but they all lived in their own primitive bubble. Too smart for their own good, but not wise enough to realize it. There's much we can learn from them. Poor humans.